The royal chambers, usually a fortress of power and certainty, had become a cage of dust and unspeakable dread. For 6 days, King David, the anointed of God, the conqueror of giants, lay stretched out on the stone floor, his mighty back against the cool indifference of the palace earth. His garments, once shimmering with the dyes of royalty, were replaced by sackcloth, now stiffened with sweat and the fine grit of the unwashed ground. He was starving himself, not as a political statement or a show of piety for the public, but in a raw, desperate battle with the Almighty himself. The infant child, the living proof of his great, terrible sin with Bathsheba, lay stricken in the next room, burning with a fever that no physician, no soothing compress, and certainly no royal decree could quench. This was the consequence Nathan the prophet had declared, the sword that would not depart from his house, beginning its terrible work. David was operating under the oldest, most primal form of grief-stricken negotiation. If he could just make himself miserable enough, if he could just deny himself the basic necessities of human existence, food, water, sleep, comfort, perhaps the scales of justice would tip back in his favor. Perhaps the sacrifice of his own living body could ransom the tiny, innocent life that was flickering away. Every breath the child took was a ragged prayer offered to a silent heaven. Every ragged breath David took was a curse directed at his own soul. He refused all food. When his most trusted servants, their faces etched with fear and confusion, tried to lift him, to coax a sip of water past his cracked lips, he fought them with the surprising brittle strength of a desperate man. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were sunken and bloodshot, fixed on an unseen point just beyond the wall, where he imagined the angel of death must be waiting, patient and implacable. The silence in the palace was oppressive. It was not the reverent silence of a court waiting for a judgment, but the agonizing quiet of a house under siege by grief. Bathsheba, whose own silent torment was likely worse, hovered in the periphery, excluded from David's self-inflicted ritual of penance, yet sharing every agonizing moment. She saw the king, her husband, reduced to an animal howling silently for mercy, and she knew the true horror of their situation was not just the loss of the baby, but the unraveling of the man who was meant to be the pillar of their nation. This 6-day vigil was not just prayer. It was an exercise in self-destruction, a powerful demonstration of the truth that even kings, when confronted with the crushing finality of consequence, are merely flesh, prone to bargaining with the divine until the very last gasp of hope is extinguished. The 7th day dawned gray and heavy, reflecting the mood of the entire city. The air inside the palace felt thick, suffocating, saturated with the residual despair of the vigil. David hadn't moved significantly in 48 hours. He was a statue of repentance, dusted with the grit of the earth he clung to. His skin was pale and tight across the bones of his face. His voice, when it came, was a rasp, demanding updates from the sick room, yet refusing to enter it, as if proximity might hasten the inevitable. This silence was the most profound torment for the servants. They whispered among themselves in corners far from the king's ear. their discussions revolving around the central, terrifying dilemma. How does one deliver a death sentence to a man who is actively courting madness? The chief physician, weary and defeated, had long run out of remedies and retreated to his quarters, leaving the final hours to fate and the fragile endurance of the infant. The servants, veterans of court intrigue and warfare, found themselves facing a scenario more frightening than any battle. If they told David the child was dead while he was already in this state of self-abasement, wouldn't he surely take his own life? Their fear wasn't baseless. David's grief was so consuming, so utterly devoid of reason, that it felt infectious, threatening to drag the entire court into the abyss of his despair. They had seen powerful men break under pressure, but never had they witnessed a king so thoroughly divest himself of his kingliness in a futile attempt to manipulate fate. Bathsheba, too, remained in a state of suspended animation. She had spent the last day simply watching the movement of the light across the room, feeling the chilling echo of the prophet's words repeating in her mind. Her grief was quieter, internalized, a heavy stone placed permanently in her chest, weighted by the knowledge that this infant, regardless of how innocent, was a symbol of their transgression. She didn't dare approach David now. His desperation was a wall insurmountable. She watched the nurses weep quietly as they changed the child's swaddling clothes for the last time, knowing that every action taken now was merely a formality preceding the ultimate release. The palace was a theater of waiting, and David, prone on the floor, represented the tragic hero who believed he could rewrite the script through sheer force of suffering. His fast was a tangible, visible prayer. God, look at how much I am hurting. Surely this is enough to pay the price. But the divine accountant seldom accepts collateral damage as adequate payment for direct consequence, and the silent vigil meant to save a life was only serving to heighten the crushing finality of the loss that was already sealed. The silent conspiracy among the servants could only hold for so long. They moved like phantoms, their steps hushed, their eyes constantly flicking toward the massive, broken figure lying near the threshold. As the sun began its inevitable descent on the seventh day, a low, guttural sigh emanated from the sick room, a sound that carried the weight of finality. A young nurse, unable to contain her sorrow or the burden of the secret, sank to her knees, weeping softly into her hands. It was this shift in the ambient sound, the cessation of hope, replaced by the sound of controlled mourning, that finally pierced the fog of David's self-imposed stupor. He stirred. He didn't rise immediately. He simply tilted his head, his ears acutely attuned to the subtle changes in the rhythm of the household. A second servant entered the chamber, her face a mask of carefully suppressed distress, only to be met by the frantic, silent head-shaking of the others. They gestured wildly behind their backs, their unspoken message screaming, "Don't let him know." But their frantic movements, the desperate anxiety pulsing visibly through their bodies, communicated everything David needed to know. Grief, in its most immediate form, rarely requires verbal confirmation. It is a shared magnetic field of sorrow. David pushed himself up onto his elbows, the simple effort costing him immensely. His voice, scratchy and weak from fasting, cut through the tension with a chilling clarity. "Is the child dead?" he asked, the words hanging in the air like icicles. The servants froze. Their inability to meet his gaze, their sudden study of the polished floor was the only answer necessary. 1,000 unspoken fears flooded the room. The fear of the king's wrath, the fear of his ensuing madness, the fear that their careful attempts to buffer him from the truth had failed catastrophically. The one servant brave enough to speak merely bowed deeply, her shoulders trembling, and whispered the single devastating confirmation: "He is dead." The room braced itself. They expected the explosion. They anticipated the renewed terrible wailing, the tearing of the surviving cloth, perhaps violence directed at themselves or the walls. They expected the descent into absolute, unforgiving despair that had defined the previous 7 days. What happened next was the first glimpse of the ancient secret they never understood. David didn't scream. He didn't rail against the heavens. He didn't lash out at the messenger. Instead, he simply collapsed forward briefly, not in renewed grief, but as if the last frayed rope holding him to the ground had been cut. Then, slowly, with immense effort, he began to rise. The movement was shocking in its unexpected purposefulness. He shook off the dust, not with petulance, but with determination. He demanded fresh water, not to drink, but to wash his face, his hands, the filth of 7 days of suicidal bargaining dissolving in the basin. He commanded them to bring him a fresh robe, one of purple and gold, rejecting the sackcloth instantly. He was transforming right before their eyes, shedding the identity of the despairing petitioner and reassuming the mantle of the king. This pivot was so jarring, so completely opposite to the behavior he had exhibited for the entire week, that it silenced the servants more effectively than any show of rage ever could. They watched, dumbfounded, as he completed his ritual of cleansing and dressing, concluding the transformation by announcing his destination: "I will go up to the house of the Lord." The transition from total, crippling grief to disciplined, ritualized action was instantaneous, leaving everyone utterly bewildered. David walked through the palace halls with a steady, if weakened, step, the rich fabric of his new robes rustling softly, a sound of defiant life interrupting the week-long silence of death. He was going to the sanctuary, not to beg for life, which was gone, but to acknowledge the source of all life and all loss. It was a profound act of spiritual relocation. The servants followed him, their confusion now boiling over into intense curiosity. They couldn't rationalize this behavior. Where was the necessary period of mourning? Where was the expected prostration over the grave? He hadn't even looked upon the lifeless body. When he returned from the sanctuary, having worshipped and poured out his heart in a way that defied the expectation of visible mourning, he made an even more astonishing demand: "Set food before me." The request for a meal, the simple act of breaking his fast, symbolized the breaking of his self-imposed bargaining ritual. The servants, led by the chief steward, dared to approach him, their voices laced with respectful, genuine worry. "My lord," the steward ventured, his brow furrowed, "while the child was yet alive, you wept and fasted and lay upon the ground. You refused all comfort. But now that the child is dead, you rise and eat bread. Why is your behavior so strange?" This question, direct and urgent, was the hinge upon which the entire revelation of the ancient secret turned. It was the moment David was compelled to articulate the profound wisdom he had accessed in his deepest hour of despair. He looked at the steward, his eyes still heavy with lack of sleep and sorrow, but now clear with an unshakable resolve. His voice, now regaining its royal timbre, was gentle yet firm, imbued with the clarity that only comes from staring into the void and returning. He acknowledged their confusion immediately. He understood why his transition seemed erratic, even disrespectful to the gravity of the loss. But David was not dismissing the grief. He was defining its boundaries. He began by recounting the logic of his vigil. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, "Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live?" This explained the desperation, the bargaining, the 7 days of self-denial. It was the human attempt to intercede, to wrestle, to change a future that felt mutable. But then came the devastating pivot, the core of the ancient secret that they had missed entirely. He continued, outlining the truth that transforms mere endurance into survival. The moment of death was the line in the sand, separating possibility from finality, dividing the realm of prayer from the necessity of acceptance. He was teaching them a crucial, agonizing lesson in spiritual pragmatism. When the outcome is undecided, you fight with every fiber of your being. When the outcome is settled, you release the struggle and begin the process of returning to life. The servants listened, rapt, as David prepared to deliver the line that would define his survival and perhaps the survival of every soul facing unbearable loss. David took a deep draught of water, the liquid tasting both bitter and sweet after the week of denial. He had explained the why of the fasting, the struggle against a mutable fate. Now he needed to explain the why of the rising, the acceptance of an immutable fate. He looked out over the faces of his worried staff, faces expecting a profound theological justification for tragedy, perhaps a hidden prophetic twist. But what he offered was simpler, more raw, and infinitely more powerful than any religious doctrine. It was an acknowledgement of the finality of existence and the duty of the living. He spoke the words that echo through history, words that unlock the ancient secret to surviving unbearable loss. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? This was not a rhetorical question meant to dismiss the child's memory. It was the ultimate, sobering acceptance of reality. It was the recognition that mourning, while essential, cannot be allowed to transition into self-annihilation, because self-annihilation serves no purpose for the lost and only destroys the future of the living. David then delivered the second, equally crucial part of the secret, the part that transforms mere resignation into spiritual hope, giving future meaning to the pain. I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. This statement is the absolute core of the paradox of enduring grief. It honors the death while asserting the continuation of life. It acknowledges the final, irreversible separation on earth, yet simultaneously asserts an eternal connection. He recognized that the deceased cannot return to the chaos and demands of the world they left, but the one who remains, through the natural course of life and death, is moving inexorably toward a reunification. It removes the burden of the impossible, bringing the dead back, and replaces it with the certainty of the inevitable, their eventual joining. This truth provides a framework for grief. Mourn fully, acknowledge the pain fiercely, but then release the burden of the past and redirect that energy toward the obligations of the present. The ritual of rising, washing, and eating was his declaration that his duty to his kingdom, to his remaining family, and to his own soul was not cancelled by the tragedy. The profound secret is this: when bargaining fails, acceptance must follow. And acceptance is not the end of love, but the beginning of living life forward while carrying love in your heart. It is the recognition that love survives the finality of the grave, but survival demands that we stop fighting a battle already lost. It is a moment of profound spiritual clarity gained only through the deepest sorrow. Think about this for a moment. When you have faced a loss that felt like it shattered the very foundation of your existence, whether it was the loss of a loved one, a career, or a dream, did you struggle most with the bargaining phase, believing your pain could somehow reverse the facts? Or did you find a moment of peace when you finally embraced the final, humbling truth that they shall not return to me? Share your perspective in the comments below. Is acceptance a form of surrender, or is it, as David seemed to understand, the ultimate, most courageous act of hope required for survival?
The decision to rise and eat was not merely an ending. It was the genesis of a new phase of David's life, a life irrevocably marked by accountability and consequence, yet fundamentally resilient. After the meal, David sought out Bathsheba. This meeting was crucial, healing the rift that had widened between them during the week of silent, separate suffering. David's grief had been loud and self-pitying. Bathsheba's had been private and weighed down by double guilt, the guilt of the initial sin and the guilt that her pain was less visible than the king's. There was no need for accusations, no recitation of the prophet's judgment. They had both paid the price. They sat together not as king and concubine, but as two individuals who had endured a devastating storm side by side, emerging soaked and chastened. David's acceptance of the loss freed Bathsheba to finally mourn openly, knowing the king had chosen resilience over self-destruction. This period of shared silence and eventual comfort was the crucible that forged their future bond. They had to learn to live with the scar, the empty space in the palace nursery, and the knowledge that every good thing they shared was shadowed by a painful divine judgment. David, having survived the intensity of his initial despair by clinging to the ancient secret, the ritualized return to life, now had to prove the long-term validity of that secret. He couldn't just mourn and move on. He had to integrate the wisdom of his loss into his identity as a leader and a man. The immediate effect was a softening of his heart, a deep, if painful, renewal of compassion. This grief taught him the fragile nature of human happiness and the immediate severity of divine law, lessons he began to channel into his governance and his worship. The psalms he wrote during this era were not songs of easy victory, but profound explorations of brokenness and restoration, of finding sanctuary not from pain, but within it. The shared suffering also shifted the nature of his relationship with Bathsheba, allowing it to transition from one rooted in transgression to one rooted in repentance and mutual support. It was in this time of quiet, chastened rebuilding that their bond deepened sufficiently to allow for the eventual birth of Solomon, the son of peace, a name that spoke volumes about the peace they had found after their tremendous, unspeakable war with consequence.
The tragedy of Absalom's rebellion and subsequent death serves as the devastating counterpoint to David's earlier, disciplined grief. The loss of the infant was private and quiet, allowing David the sacred space to perform his ritual of release and acceptance, the ancient secret of, "I shall go to him." The loss of Absalom was loud, public, and politically catastrophic,
shattering the kingdom and nearly costing David his throne. When the news of Absalom's death finally reached David, the grief was overwhelming, raw, and entirely uncontrolled. It lacked the profound, quiet clarity of the earlier mourning. David was not lying in sackcloth in the dust, bargaining with God. He was weeping hysterically in the chamber above the gate, crying out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son!" This grief was an absolute refusal of the finality he had once accepted. It was self-indulgent, paralyzing, and profoundly dangerous to his kingdom, leading Joab to finally rebuke the king for elevating his personal sorrow above the survival and morale of the soldiers who had risked their lives to save his kingdom. This contrast provides a vital component to understanding the ancient secret, the necessity of disciplined sorrow. The loss of the infant, though devastating, had a clear boundary. It was the consequence of his sin, and the payment had been made. David accepted that truth and rose. The loss of Absalom was far more complex. It was driven by love, failure, guilt, and the profound tragedy of a father who failed his son. David's love for Absalom was so intertwined with his failure to discipline him and his guilt over Amnon's murder that when Absalom died, David's grief was not merely sorrow, it was an expression of total, incapacitating parental guilt. He wanted to die for his son because, on some level, he felt responsible for the trajectory of violence that led to his death. This raw, uncontrolled grief, though understandable on a human level, risked destroying the entire fragile stability of Israel. The secret to surviving loss is not just acknowledging death, but recognizing that life imposes duties that transcend even the most agonizing personal pain. David, for a time, forgot this lesson, allowing his grief to become a political liability, proving that the secret must be actively practiced and reapplied, even after one thinks they have mastered it. David's eventual recovery from the Absalom tragedy required a far more forceful intervention than the quiet realization he achieved after the infant's death. Joab's harsh words, compelling him to prioritize his kingdom over his heartbreak, forced David to snap back into the reality of his royal duties. He was compelled to put the ancient secret back into practice, rising, dressing, and re-engaging with the living. But the emotional cost was immense, and drove David back to the deepest sanctuary of his soul, the writing of the Psalms. It is in the wisdom literature that David truly synthesizes the lessons of his unbearable losses. Psalm 51, written immediately after Nathan's confrontation regarding Bathsheba and the subsequent death of the infant, is a profound testament to accountability and the search for internal purity. It is the core text that proves the secret is not about avoiding pain, but about transforming the pain into compassion and growth. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. The loss of the infant broke his arrogance and his self-deception, allowing the possibility of a pure heart to emerge from the wreckage. Later psalms, born from the deeper wounds of Absalom's betrayal and death, move beyond mere confession into the agonizing territory of existential despair, yet always anchor themselves back to the necessity of hope and trust in a sovereign plan, even when that plan involves unbearable loss. The ultimate lesson gleaned from these crises, the first loss revealing acceptance, the second revealing the danger of undisciplined grief, is that suffering, when correctly managed, acts as a refining fire. David's unique contribution to the understanding of survival is the recognition that grief is a necessary, painful process that must be given its due, but it is fundamentally a temporary state. The body demands mourning, but the spirit demands resurrection. The secret lies in establishing the ritual boundary between the two. The week of fasting was the ritual for the lost possibility. The washing, rising, and eating was the ritual for the enduring duty. This rhythm, this necessary demarcation between prostration and purpose, is the foundation for overcoming despair. The trauma remains, but its power to paralyze is neutralized by the conscious choice to re-engage with the stream of life, believing always in that final reunification. I shall go to him.
The ancient secret, therefore, is not a hidden scripture or a complex theological formula, but a profound, necessary act of will rooted in spiritual truth. It is the ability, in the face of the most agonizing, unbearable loss, the loss of a child, the loss of a life's meaning, the loss of one's own integrity, to stop demanding what cannot be returned and to start embracing what must still be done. David's life, marked by staggering highs and crushing lows, provides the ultimate blueprint for this resilience. The first, quiet tragedy taught him the power of radical acceptance. When the facts are immutable, the struggle must cease. The subsequent louder tragedies, Amnon, Absalom, taught him the necessity of self-discipline in grief. Unchecked sorrow can destroy the living and dishonor the memory of the dead by rendering the survivor useless. The secret is held in that paradoxical declaration, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. The first clause is the anchor of hope, the belief in an eternal destiny that transcends immediate loss. The second clause is the necessary painful realism that prevents us from turning grief into an idol, preventing us from sacrificing our present life on the altar of the past. For anyone today who finds themselves prostrate in the dust, unable to rise from the crushing weight of a loss that feels insurmountable, David's story offers this profound, humbling guidance. You have fought your fight. You have pleaded your case, and now the verdict is final. The time for bargaining is over. The time for rising has come. You are permitted your sorrow, but you are also required to live, to wash the dust from your robes, and to seek the purpose that remains. The secret is that survival is not about forgetting the one you lost, but about honoring their memory by refusing to let the light they brought into your life be extinguished by the shadow of their departure. The strength to rise is not drawn from the hope of reversal, but from the certainty of continuation, a truth only accessible when we cease our internal war against reality. It is the ultimate act of courage to acknowledge the finality of human loss while simultaneously asserting the infinite tenacity of the soul. This is the enduring lesson, the bedrock truth discovered by a broken king in the dust of his own palace, a truth available to every soul navigating the terrifying wilderness of despair. It is the power to say, with clarity and conviction, the mourning is done, and the living must now assume their duties, for in time I shall go to him. And that knowledge, that certainty of eventual reunion, transforms agonizing finality into purposeful endurance.